Greetings. Thank you for tuning in to another edition of History 1302. For those of you that have been with us for the last several weeks, we've been talking about the populist movement. We've been talking about the issues at hand regarding agrarian poverty and the idea that the government isn't working for the people that need it the most. Now, we also understand that ultimately the populists ended in defeat. They were not successful in getting through some of the reforms that they had really felt were near and dear to their heart. But the one thing that the Populist Party was able to accomplish was it got more and more people thinking about some of these critical issues at hand. For instance, there were still the problems in the cities that were not being addressed. There were still problems with the working conditions in many of these factories, and they were not being addressed. And probably most concerning to middle-class Americans was this issue of radicalism, that it was one thing that these immigrants from places like Europe and Asia were bringing over some relatively radical political doctrines, but the fact that these issues, which were pressing concerns, were not being addressed by either party in American politics, gave these radicals, socialists, anarchists, later communists, sort of a sounding board when it comes to recruiting, simply because there wasn't a lot being done. The social movement, and to some extent the political movement that emerges out of the failure of the Populist Party, that would be progressivism. Now let me give you a really easy way of remembering progressivism for your notes. Progressivism was many things, but most of all what it was a middle-class movement. It was primarily a collection of middle-class women that were concerned with some of these issues that we've been talking about, especially in the cities. But more than anything else, what this movement was about was providing protection for those individuals that needed it the most and were least likely, least capable of protecting themselves. So if you were to point to a face for the progressive movement, that face would be Jane Addams. Jane Addams was the quintessential progressive, so to speak, considering that she had grown up in an upper-middle-class family in Chicago. And in her early formulative years, she had done what middle-class people do. She had traveled around the world, and one of the places that really made a deep and profound impression on her was her visit to England, London in particular. Now, one of the things that Addams noted was that England had some of the same problems that Chicago had. It had a working-class population that was primarily immigrant-based, and many of these immigrants were treated as second-class citizens, and there was institutionalized inequality in their everyday life. But one thing that she noted that the British were doing that was different than what the Americans were doing, it all came down to the settlement house. That one of the things that London had were settlement houses that would help these immigrants get adjusted, get on their feet, and acclimated to their new surroundings. Jane Addams was so impressed by this idea of the settlement house that she took the concept back to Chicago when she returned to the United States. Teamed up with a woman who happened to be her friend, a woman by the name of Helen Gates Starr, and together they founded arguably the most famous settlement house in American history, Hull House. Now, let me explain what Hull House was. In essence, Hull House was an advocate for the immigrant. It was a go-between. I mean, if you think about your reading, both in your big blue book or The Jungle, there are very few individuals or organizations that go to bat for the workers or the immigrants. So therefore, what Hull House was a go-between between the city government in Chicago and the immigrants that had a hard time adjusting to their new homeland. Now, one of the things that you could do if you needed to use Hull House, if you happen to be a working mother, you could drop your children off and you knew that they would be safe, that you didn't have to worry about them coming to a tragic end the same way that Jurgis Rudkis' little boy does. In some instances, they offered English classes at Hull House. But for the most part, Hull House was designed to do what the city of Chicago was not doing, and that's provide protection for the people that were most vulnerable to this industrial, urban situation that had caused so much chaos in American life. Now, another face when it comes to progressivism would be that of Alice Paul. Now, Alice Paul was a suffragette in the sense that she felt very strongly that in order to really call yourself a democracy, you would need to enfranchise 51% of the voting public. In other words, women needed the right to vote. She felt that there was a double standard in American life involving the cult of true womanhood, in the sense that there were things that men could do, men could get away with, and women could not. And one of the things that women were not theoretically supposed to do was to speak out in public. Well, clearly what had evolved by the turn of the 20th century was what we would call a glass ceiling. There were certain occupations, there were certain realms of American life that were simply off limits to women. Alice Paul wanted to shatter this glass ceiling, and in doing that, what she did is she started an organization called the National Women's Party. What this organization was dedicated in doing, among other things, but primarily, it was dedicated in getting women the right to vote. That this was never going to truly be a democracy unless women had the power to elect governmental officials that would speak out on behalf of their best interests. Now, of course, men tried to dispel this concept that women be involved in politics, and they did so through chivalric ways. Chivalry. That politics was a dirty business and women were better off not in there. And they said that we are trying to protect women from the dirty business that is politics. And what people like Alice Paul, and to some extent Jane Addams, said, if you're really interested in providing protection to us, what you will do is you will give us the right to vote. So once again, one group of people that are particularly susceptible to this whole issue of urbanization and industrialization, that's women. And when they speak up in public, what Alice Paul is saying is we can kill two birds with one stone here. One, we can enfranchise 51% of the population, and two, we can elect politicians that are warm to the issues that are near and dear to our hearts, as female heads of households, female workers, female consumers, females generally speaking. Let me push this envelope a little bit further. Many of you may have noted this part of The Jungle where it describes the color of milk, and many of you who maybe were not reading that book all that carefully are asking yourself, why is that even a question? Milk is white. Well, throughout much of the early 20th century, milk was not white, it was blue, because the dairy trusts would treat it with various chemicals, including formaldehyde, in order to have it last for longer. I mean, obviously, if you could advertise that your milk would not expire before your competitors, you would have a competitive advantage in the marketplace. That was all fine and well, except for when you consumed it, you were consuming not only the milk, you were also consuming the chemicals at the same time. So what happened was an organization that called itself the National Consumer League, primarily composed of women, got together and they began to put pressure first on the dairy trusts, but then ultimately on governmental officials to provide some sort of regulation with respect to what producers was putting into the milk. You also see a concern for child labor. I mean, we're talking about a time period where children are not only employed, but there are a lot of industries that are actually really using a lot of child labor. You see this really progress all the way into 1908 with the Supreme Court ruling entitled Mueller versus Oregon. Now, Mueller versus Oregon was not necessarily concerned with child labor as much as it was concerned with labor of women. And if you can think back to The Jungle, you'll know that every female in that household works, and it's necessary to make ends meet at the end of the month. But back to my story, Mueller versus Oregon. This was a case involving the maximum amount of hours that you could legally work a woman. Now, we've already talked about the Knights of Labor, and we've talked about their 8-hour push that pretty much ended in 1886. Right? Mueller versus Oregon was going down that same road once again. And this time what the Supreme Court ruled was that when it comes to women's labor, if you were to work a woman for too long, you could possibly jeopardize her reproductive capabilities. Now, many of us that study medicine or the human anatomy will understand that that's not necessarily the case. It's certainly not necessarily politically correct even, But at the time, what they're doing is they're trying to provide protection for individuals that cannot protect themselves or would have a hard time protecting themselves. And so what Moeller versus Oregon does is it sets the legal limit that you could work a woman at 10 hours. And you have to understand that this had not been done before. The Knights of Labor had tried it, various other groups in American working class society had tried it, and nobody had really had much success. Women were unique in this sense. So once again, what you're seeing here with the progressive movement, people are trying to address these really big issues involving urbanization, industrialization, and things that neither the Democrats nor the Republicans are taking up. Now, one of the ways that the progressives are getting their message out there, both to politicians but also the general American public, that would be through a process known as muckraking journalism. It is exactly what it sounds like it is. It's an expose of relatively dirty, relatively unattractive, ugly situations. There were various magazines that were printed throughout this time period that specialized in these graphic exposés. McClure's magazine was one of them. Or one of my personal favorites, this is a book that is published during this period, Ida Tarbell's The History of the Standard Oil Company. It was this scathing review of John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company and all the shady ways that he was using to pretty much monopolize the industry that was petroleum. Another favorite piece of mine that comes out of this period, Nellie Bly's 10 Days in the Madhouse. We're talking about a time period when American doctors used to treat anorexic patients by simply denying them their clothes. They would lock you up and say, look, if you want your clothes back, what you need to do is eat. Well, they were treating what is essentially a mental disease through physical treatment. So you have to understand that a lot of these individuals that would be classified, certainly not as criminally insane, certainly not mentally ill, are all being lumped together in these mental institutions, but nobody's talking about it. Well, it's Nellie Bly and people like her that are bringing this to light. But the most famous muckraking journalist that I need you to be mindful of, you're actually reading right now, Upton Sinclair, is arguably the most famous muckraking journalist of the time. And what the jungle ultimately was, I mean, if you read Sinclair's preface or introduction, was his version of Uncle Tom's Cabin. I mean, if you remember back to 1301, Uncle Tom's Cabin was the Bible of the anti-slavery movement. Sinclair wanted the jungle to be the Bible of the reform movement of the early 20th century. But if you recall, what probably stands out in your mind is all the nastiness that's being put in the meat by the meat packers. Parts of hands themselves, rat droppings, you name it. There's all this nasty stuff that's being put in there. And so when most people picked up the jungle, what really resonated with them was, the obvious health concerns regarding what was going into American food. So what these people are doing is they're publicizing the problems, and they're really forcing the hands of both Democrats and Republicans when it comes to implementing reform. Now, another event, that went a long way when it comes to publicizing the need for reform would be the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in 1911. March 25th, 1911, fire broke out in a sewing factory. The Triangle Shirtwaist Company made garments for women, but they had several ways of really enforcing a stringent work ethic while you were on the company's time. For instance, they would pack people into these sewing rooms with very little room in between them. Obvious fire hazard if there was to be an emergency and everybody needed to get out ASAP. The other problem that they had was they locked the door when it comes to after the shift had begun. The only problem was it was locked from the inside out. So if you follow logic along with me, what you've got is a situation. If you've got an emergency, there's no way of getting out. There was one elevator that provided relief for this particular event, and when the fire broke out on the 9th and 10th floor, your only real hope was to get a place inside that elevator And for everybody else that was not lucky enough to do that, you had a choice. You could die in the flames, or you could jump out the window, and you could go splat all over the pavement. And that's exactly what 146 people, mostly women and girls, mostly did. 146 people died in what came to be known as the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire of 1911, and it demonstrated without any shadow of a doubt the obvious need for reform. If you're going to employ the American public when it comes to your particular business, you need to do things like provide fire escapes. You need to have things like fire codes. You can only have this amount of people in the employment on the shop floor at one particular time. So the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire really became a lightning rod when it comes to the need for reform. And in a lot of ways, it did lead to a reform, especially in New York. Now, another issue that I need you to be mindful of would be racism. We are talking about an unmistakable racist society. Jim Crow laws had really become the law of the land, not just in the South. You're also beginning to see this to some extent in the North. In places like Detroit, New York, there were these things called restrictive covenants. And if you think about it, a covenant is an agreement. This restrictive covenant was an agreement between the neighborhood and the family, the individual homeowner. And if there ever came a time where you needed to sell your house, the agreement was you would only sell it to a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant family. It was designed to keep specific groups of Americans out of specific neighborhoods, and not just based on the color of their skin. And we've also talked about issues like Plessy versus Ferguson in this class, the Supreme Court case ruling that pretty much legalized separate and unequal. My point is you've got a lot of institutionalized inequality when it comes to basing it on race, the same way that you've got a lot of institutionalized inequality based on class, what you do for a living. Now, you need to understand that there are a lot of reformers, racial reformers, that have made their way to the public pulpit, when it comes to this issue. And I want to discuss three of them with you. The first one is a guy by the name of Booker T. Washington. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Washington. Washington was a former slave. He had grown up as a child through slavery, so you would expect him to be one of the most radical individuals that you could imagine when it comes to integration. Washington is, in fact, what we call a racial accommodist, right? Accommodationalist. He gave this speech in Atlanta in which he pretty much assures white America that civil rights reformers are not asking for Rome to be built in a day. In other words, they're not asking for integration now. What, in fact, they are asking for is good industrial jobs. Washington understands that in order to walk, you need to be able to crawl, and in order to run, you need to be able to walk. And he understands that the idea of integration is not really going to come before there is a sound economic, financial foothold in the black community. So this speech that he makes in Atlanta is basically an appeal to white business owners, individuals like Andrew Carnegie, to hire black workers. And he asks them very directly, why would you hire somebody from overseas when you've got good, dutiful black workers that are plentiful here in the United States? They speak English, they understand American culture, and more than anything else, they're very, very loyal. To really ensure that that this was an effective sales pitch, it's Washington that starts the Tuskegee Institute, an industrial technical school is what we would probably call it today, in Tuskegee, Alabama. Now, what they're offering is the racist social structure in exchange for good paying industrial jobs. In other words, keep white power. You can keep the white racist power structure in place. We're not asking for that to change. What we would like in exchange for that, though, are good paying industrial jobs. The exact opposite, the night and day opposite of Booker T. Washington would be W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, whereas Washington grew up a slave, Du Bois had been educated at Harvard University. So he was a highly, highly educated man. He had a doctorate from Harvard. And when it came to their approach to civil rights, they differed very greatly as well. Whereas Washington was an accommodationist, Du Bois is a separatist. In other words, what Du Bois is calling for is not integration at any rate. It's not good industrial jobs even. It's jobs that are provided to the black community by the black community. What Du Bois is essentially saying is that you're never going to get a fair shake from white America. So in that way, what you need is not to beg to get into the white man's schools as much as you need black schools that are effective and sufficient for black children. You need black hospitals, you need black banks, you need black restaurants, you need black hotels. In short, you need to do everything that you possibly can to separate from white America. The third individual that I'd like you to be mindful of when it comes to racism and the progressive movement would be Ida B. Wells Barnett. Now, Wells was an activist within racial reform circles, but she was also a muckraking journalist. And we remember that one of the things that the muckrakers were trying to do was bring so much attention to this whole issue of things that were going on unnoticed in American life. One of the things that were going on unnoticed was the institution of lynching, right? Mob vigilante violence that rained terror on the black community. Ida B. Wells would publish both written stories and also photographs of exactly what went into the act of a lynching, right? Everything from the hanging itself to the mutilation of the body to the individuals that were there that comprised that of the lynch mob, many of which looked like they were in their Sunday best, right? But you have to understand that there is no federal law that makes lynching a federal crime during this period. So what is it that Ida B. Wells is trying to do? Well, she's trying to do the same thing that Sinclair's trying to do, put enough pressure on the government to provide protection for people who clearly cannot protect themselves. So together, what you have is a variety of approaches to implementing civil rights in American life. All of this comes to a head in 1911. It comes to a head in an event that will be known as the Niagara Movement. Okay? The Niagara Movement took place in Niagara, Ontario. Now, why did it not take place in Buffalo, New York, right across the river from Niagara? Well, the hotel rooms in Buffalo were segregated, and therefore they had no choice but to hold it in Canada. Nonetheless, what the Niagara Movement outlined, and this is worth writing down, it outlined a civil rights platform, a plan of attack for implementing civil rights reform. It's there that you really begin to see the acceleration of the NAACP, a civil rights organization that will spot, detect racism and discrimination, segregation where it sees it, and try to not only bring it to the public's attention, but bring it into the courts. Keep in mind, it's primarily the NAACP that was responsible for the legal integration of the schools in the 1950s. At any rate, the NAACP elects Webb Du Bois as their president, and they begin a newspaper known as The Crisis. And they're using this paper, magazine really, to not only communicate with one another, but also get the word out as to why racial reform is so very necessary. So what I want to leave you with is a lot of those questions that went on unanswered in the 1890s. Problems involving urbanization, industrialization, racism, and I include xenophobic racism in all of that discussion. A lot of those issues went on unaddressed, and neither the Democratic Party nor the Republican Party dared to take them up. One of the things that the progressives are doing when it comes to forcing this issue is they're bringing so much attention and so much concern to these issues. Industrialization and the need for reform so that we can make it for a safe workplace. Urbanization, something as simple as putting a fire escape on an apartment complex. It's forcing mainstream politicians within, let's say, the Republican Party to take up these issues. Otherwise, they run the risk of losing elections, losing out to progressive Democrats, or losing out to third-party candidates that are providing or offering at least a different way of providing reform. So what I want you to think about now as we move into the progressive era is what kind of reform is needed and more importantly, what kind of measures need to be taken by the government to ensure that those people that are most susceptible to things like industrialization and urbanization have the protection that they need.